So we'll dive straight in. The science around climate change. This is quite a small image, but it shows you a little bit around the greenhouse effect. Anybody give me a wave if you've heard of the greenhouse effect before? A couple of people nodding. That's great. So basically, it's just around when the levels of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the environment start to rise. They can't really escape, so a lot of more of the sun's energy gets trapped, and then the Earth warms up. And this is a particular problem for the oceans because around 90% of that trapped energy ends up in the oceans, which is a large proportion of our Earth's surface. So you can imagine how that affects some of the ecosystems in there and the very sensitive wildlife that exists in those climates. So greenhouse gases in themselves, and we'll talk a little bit more about the different types of greenhouse gases, but they're essentially emitted mostly by human activities, or the ones that we measure around climate change tend to be the ones that are emitted around human activities that alter that Earth's balance in terms of what's in the atmosphere and what should be in the atmosphere. Obviously, there are other causes, things like volcanoes. If you remember that Icelandic volcano that blew up a few years ago, that they've measured all sorts of things around the gases that came out of that, which was very interesting. And I'm sure you can find all sorts of things on that. But I'll let you do your research on that if you have an interest. Um, so what we'll be looking at is kind of the human effect on climate, specifically around changing uses of land surfaces, so deforestation and intensive farming, that sort of thing. So this is a nice little image slide. I hope you can see it. I've blown it up as well as I can. And it's a 2017 breakdown of the different levels of emissions that the whole of British society produces. As you can see, museums will fall into that business category at 17%. So it's quite substantial, and it's actually one of the biggest emitters. It's much more than, say, waste management, but also outpaces residential as well, which I think surprises a lot of people. But you can also see the transport and the energy sections quite high as well. The particular fossil fuels that we'll be looking at in this case, there is a term that's used for fossil fuels together, which is CO2e, and that is just a combination of all of these different fuels on the screen here. So CO2 would be your traditional fossil fuels, what you think of as causing climate change, which comes from petrol and things like that, but also cement production and deforestation as well. But the other ones that are on here, which are perhaps not the first ones that people think about, is methane, which comes from the whole agriculture process, beginning to end, for not just meat products, but also vegetable products as well, and landfill and waste management. And then you've got your nitrous oxides, which are things like your fertilizers, and the fluorinated gases, which used to be quite a big thing a few years ago around refrigeration and aerosol. But these days is perhaps more linked to things like refrigerated trucks and trains for transport of goods. The interesting thing that I've linked down here is around commercial versus individual impacts. And this is something called the Carbon Majors Report. Again, it's a couple of years out of date now, but they keep adding to it. And it's a very interesting read if you get the chance and you develop an interest. And it talks about kind of the 100 few companies in the world that are responsible for the biggest pollution. So it is a relative scale. And what museums can achieve is perhaps on the lower end of the scale versus kind of companies like Shell and other petroleum companies. So this is all relative, but it is an interesting read if you have a time to have a little scoot through it. So let's talk about the actual impacts on us, which is probably why you're here. So the quote that I've put on there is from the Independent Panel on Climate Change, I think, International, Panel on Climate Change, which was a panel that was set up a few years after the Paris Agreement, which is something that you may have possibly heard of in the news. And it's basically the big international gathering of various different governments deciding to try and tackle climate change. We'll talk a bit about that later. But this is what they've said, that we need to try and limit our global warming to 1.5 degrees, and we have until 2030 to cut those global emissions by 50%. And I'll show you how we're doing in a moment. We then have another couple of decades until 2050 to reach net zero, which is another term that gets bandied around. And it basically means reducing all your carbon emissions to the point where you're not emitting anymore. The pictures I've put on here were chosen quite specifically. I don't know if you recognize any of them. Anybody recognize anything there? No? This one at the top here is the wildfires that happened in Yorkshire not that long ago. You may remember from the news. This one in the middle is Birmingham's air pollution issues. This one down the bottom is actually from last year, from the heat wave. And then I can't remember exactly where this one was. Flooding. We'll get on to more flooding pictures shortly. So the biggest impacts on our museums as a result of all this science stuff, which you can dip into more if you have an interest, or you may just want to kind of take it as read. The actual impacts on museums are the things that we perhaps worry about more. Specifically things like weather events. And I promised you another flooding picture. And this picture here in the middle is one of the museums on my patch, which is the River and Rowing Museum and their flooding issue. And they're right next to the river, so this happens occasionally, perhaps more occasionally than many. Anybody else here had flood problems with their museums? No? You're very lucky. Most museums at least have one bit of leaky roof somewhere. The other things that you could find that climate change impacts your museum would be around other vulnerabilities to your building. So you may find, like the picture at the bottom, that if you have a very hot, dry season, that you may have a vulnerability to fire if your building lends itself to that, especially if you're in a building with a thatched roof, could be a big risk for you. I've also mentioned vulnerable visitors and vulnerable staff and volunteers. And I don't know if you remember all the train problems we had a little while ago, especially over the summer with sort of rails kinking and problems getting to and from work. And if you're in an area where you've got to get your staff, your volunteers and your visitors by public transport, that can be a big issue for you. The picture at the top, I believe, is from the Ashmolean Museum, or it might be the British Museum. I think it might be the British Museum looking at it. And this one is around sort of climate justice and sponsorship deals. So there is potential reputational risks for working with certain sponsors for your museum, and also around kind of accessibility as well. So how does your museum engage with this topic, and are they doing it in an equitable way, and whether or not that itself can be a reputational risk, depending on how high profile you are and whether or not you have a local activism group. But that's yes, it can be it's very dependent on your particular location and your various local ecosystem around you as well. One of the more sort of broad terms that can affect our museums would be around insurance costs. I'm sure a lot of you have found that insurance costs have risen. I see some nods there, yeah, definitely. And we can also find that pest infestations can get worse if we have weather events that cause that. I don't know how many of you here are in urban settings. Have you ever heard of the urban heat effect? Yeah, a few nods there. This essentially means that in an urban built-up area without a lot of greenery around it, your temperatures can rise almost 7 degrees higher than anywhere else. So you could have even higher heat than what is telling you on your thermometer or on your news broadcast, because the amount of built-up area is reflecting all that light. So it can actually sort of compound the issue as well. Air pollution is a big problem, especially in more built-up areas as well. The picture that I showed you in Birmingham, there's there's a report on Birmingham's air pollution and how it contributes to so many deaths per year, which you can also look up if you have an interest. But that can affect your visitors. It can affect your volunteers, especially if you've got vulnerable volunteers, elderly volunteers, or volunteers that have health problems. That can be a problem for you as well. And then the picture at the top I've put down is around activism and security. Now, this tends to be more of an issue if you're in a central museum, say in London or one of the larger cities, and you have a high-profile collection. So if you're in somewhere like the Ashmolean Museum or the British Museum or somewhere like that, and you've got high-profile status, you may find that you could be a target for people like Just Stop Oil, that sort of thing. So you might have more of a security issue there, and you'll have to pay for a better security budget. So it all comes down to money, doesn't it? But this can affect any museum in any location, especially industrial museums as well. They can sometimes be a target for this sort of activism too. So it can have very real effects on our lives in museum world. So I promised you some news on how we've been doing as a country. This is, again, some figures from 2017, just because they happen to do a lot of work in 2017. And this graph that I'm showing you on here, it shows you the downward trend of how much carbon we're releasing into the atmosphere. As you can see, this is pretty good news. We've already producing less greenhouse gases than we did in 1997, 50% less actually. However, our target is to cut CO2 by 80%. So we've still got a little bit of work to do. But since 2004, renewable energy in the UK has massively increased, and 37% of our electricity is now from renewable sources. And if you compare that to some other countries in the world, France, their public transport runs 90% on renewable energy. So we've got a long way to go to catch up with France. But if we look at Poland, which runs its public transport on coal, 80% on coal, we're doing better than Poland. So swings and roundabouts, but it's nice to know that we're going in the right direction. So I would say that change is in our hands. It is a sliding scale, as I mentioned, but we can do our bit just as well. I mentioned around national and international government efforts, and I spoke a little bit about the Paris Agreement, but the one that you've probably heard more about in the news of recent years is COP 25, 26. Anybody recognize those names? Yeah, one or two nods, wonderful. So essentially that's just countries coming together, trying to work out what they're going to do. On the whole, when they've done this, they've come up with some good things, like pledges to end deforestation, but most of the time they haven't quite gone far enough. So we need to do our bit where our governments haven't quite married up to our expectations. So we've got actually lots of areas of influence. And I'm sorry that this graph is a little hard to read, but I wanted to sort of talk about some of the areas that we have power over, that we can do something about. Some of the biggest sections on this graph are around building our knowledge, like you're all doing here in this training, which is fantastic, and around our purchasing power, because as museums we have huge purchasing power, and not just with what we buy for our shops and our cafes and our collections, but also in how we invest our pensions and how we invest other funds that we use. So there's lots of ways that we can go greener and more ethical with those things as well. We also have a huge amount of influence over how we get our energy. So we can choose to get our energy from renewable sources as much as we can. We can think about how we travel and how our visitors travel. And we can think about how we deal with our waste as well. I think some of the things that successful museums have done that have sort of set the tone for this is to try and work together with as many partners or colleagues or visitors or any stakeholder they want to involve in this, choosing those partners carefully so you don't get into any sponsorship problems, because we don't want that for you. But yeah, working together seems to be a hallmark of successful projects. Training as well, formal and informal. So this is probably more of a mid-formal training, but we do offer more advanced training as well. So if you decide that you like this topic and you want to know more, you could do our carbon literacy training, and we'd be very happy to have you. Some museums have looked into things like learning on the job with environmental champions, and also sort of building those green manifestos for the culture of their organisations, which has been quite successful. Working with community co-curation, and lots of funding opportunities, which we'll get onto a little bit later with our green grants, but also sort of bringing the board along with you. So if you're going to start thinking about this, think about how you do it at all levels of your organisation, not just where you are. And there is lots of support out there for you. There's support for sort of if you're having problems with any anxiety around the topic, and also practical support for the work that you want to do. And I'll give you some links at the end of the training for that as well. So the first case study that I'd like to introduce a guest speaker. So we have a lovely case study today from Tom Brown School Museum, who received a Going Green grant. And I'd like to hand over, if she's there, to Karen, who's going to speak to it for us. Karen, would you like to take over?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. And apologies that nobody can see me, but I can't get the camera to work on my laptop, so apologies for that. So we were very grateful for a £1,500 grant from SEMD, which went towards the total cost of just under 4,600 of replacing our heating system. Just a little bit of background, we're a very small museum in a village, in a grade 2 listed building, 400 years old with no running water. We're only open at the weekends during the summer, so we get on average about 1,000 visitors. So we are slightly limited in terms of what we can do. However, one of the things that we did look at was our heating system. We had a very old 30-year-old system, which was basically storage heaters. And you could either switch the heating on or off. There was nothing in between, which meant that we were using more energy. So that had an impact environmentally anyway, but also had an impact on our cost base. And also because we're all totally volunteer run, I hate to say it, but we did have volunteers fiddling with the controls. So you'd go in during the week and wonder why the heating was still on and it was 30 degrees outside. So I did quite a bit of investigation in terms of what we could do to replace the storage heaters that we had. Managed to get 3 quotes. And one of the things that we did, and in terms of the chosen company that we use, is because they were local. We used a company called Cotswold Heating. So again, looking at the distance that they had to travel to get to us to actually install our new system, that had an effect on why we chose this particular company. So ultimately, because of the grant that we did get, and also a grant that we got from a local trust that runs in our area, we were able to replace the storage heaters for these new radiators. The benefit being that we can now set a minimum temperature. We can actually set different temperatures 6 times a day, which is probably a little bit over the top for us. But not only does it mean that our visitors are getting a more ambient environment, but it's also much better for our collection. It means that it's either neither too hot or too cold. So that's been a real benefit for us. The other thing being that nowadays you can control them from a mobile app. So again, cutting down on the time that we have to spend actually going into the museum when it's not open to actually control the temperature. So that's really it in a nutshell. There's a little bit more information on the slide. But the very final thing that I put on the bottom is we are very grateful, because without the grant that we had from both of our beneficiaries, we wouldn't have been able to change our heating system. So thank you.
Thank you, Karen. That was really interesting, and we're very glad to have helped. We've got a couple more case studies for you, so I'm going to jump on to the next one for you. And this is Cooper and Newton Museum. I believe we have Marion here today. There's Marion. Hello.
Hi, hello. Hello.
Marion's very kindly offered to give us a little bit of context about their project as well. Over to you, Marion.
Thank you. The Cooper and Newton Museum is another small museum in the market town of Olney, and it's a Georgian Grade 2 listed building with two also Grade 2 listed gardens. And I have always been interested in climate change and so on, and I wanted to do something. For us, really, the issue was partly about gaining information to know what we could do for the best, really. And we were kindly given a grant of £2,000. Again, we are volunteer led. We have two part-time members of staff. But one of the things we wanted to do was to do an audit on our carbon emissions. And so some of our grant was used to fund our additional time for one of our part-time members of staff to actually conduct that audit using a website called Julie's Bicycle. And it's quite comprehensive, and although not, I would say, 100% accurate, because some of it you have to try and make guess estimates on, I would say, particularly in our case, as we were having to go retrospectively to get the information. So we did that, and you go into things like you're looking at your electricity usage and gas usage and waste management. You can also look at transport and so on, but we decided not to do that, partly because it was retrospective. There was virtually no public transport in Olney or to Olney, so just about everybody has to come by car anyway if they're from outside of the town. So there was not much an option. But it's something we'll probably think about for the future, but for this particular exercise we didn't do that. So we carried out our audit, and it was quite interesting that we found that our energy costs obviously were quite high, but we were also really bad at wastage, which I was quite surprised at, because we sort of, like most places, you probably think, you know, you're fairly good, but actually we weren't at all. We were terrible. And so that was something obviously we decided we wanted to do. The other thing then was to try and get everybody on board, because we have a lot of volunteers. A lot of them are elderly, very well-meaning, but a lot of them don't always understand perhaps some of the things that are coming out. And I'm not being nasty when I say that, because I'm in that older bracket too. We also at the time had a chair of our trustees who was very anti-climate change and spoke quite vigorously about it. So there was a big education thing to go through as well. So one of the things that when we did the audit, I did a presentation with our trustees, telling them the outcomes of the audit, but also a little bit about the impacts of climate change on a museum, because for us, we've certainly suffered because of things like the weather events. In the very, very hot summer, we actually closed the museum for a couple of days because it was simply too hot for people to work. We've got no air conditioning or anything like that. Too hot for our visitors, too hot for our volunteers, too hot for our staff. Our gardens were suffering terribly. We only water our gardens with rainwater, and there was we have no irrigation systems or anything like that, and there simply wasn't any water, so things were dying off. And we also found inside. We often have problems with humidity in our museum, and a combined problem with the heat and humidity was we were finding damage being caused to things like furniture, and also we're having problems with bugs and things like that. So that was also something that we were able to explain some of the impacts, and that was very successful. And because of that, our trustees really taken this now on board. And at the time, we were completely rewriting our forward plan. And so sustainability in the carbon literacy has really now become very, very quite centrally focused within that plan, which I think has been a big move forward. Now, around that as well, we also decided, because of this issue with waste, we needed to do something with our volunteers. So we offered a training for our volunteers. We had about 25 came along, and we went through similar kind of thing, a little bit about climate change, impact on the museum, had some fun things around it as well, which you can do. There's a really good book called How Bad Are Bananas, which we use bits from that, which were really fun, and they quite enjoyed trying to guess which is the most environmentally cup of coffee you could have, and things like that. But that sort of thing really engaged our volunteers. And we had got them to come up with ideas of things we could do. And they came up with some wacky things, some completely off the wall things, but they also came up with some really useful things as well. And we've taken that on board, and have used some of our bits of money to do little things. And so, for example, we completely changed our whole recycling thing now. So we've got new bins. We now only use organic tea bags so they can go out on the compost bin. We've got food waste caddies in our volunteers' kitchen and so on. Now, these might sound quite trite, but actually they're really important for getting people on board and understanding and getting people engaged. And we've also been looking at doing other things. So we went round and took out some of our lights, spotlights and things around the museum. Don't need them. We've changed our garden mower over to an electric one rather than a petrol one. We've been doing quite a big project in our garden, replacing sheds and paths and all sorts. And that's all been done with refurbished and recyclable materials. So we've had sheds that we've been donated to us, that we've gone and collected from somebody's garden. We've fencing that again is being reused from bits, built new compost bins and so on, and all of that. We're putting in a bug hotel for the children so that they can go and stuff things in it, home for the bugs, and developed a few sort of programs for children around the garden and environment. And we've also we have an office which gets terribly hot because it faces the sun, and we bought a solar paneled fan to go in there, which has actually works a treat. So now that works really well. We're just about to introduce lighting, some of these light sensors in some of our top rooms. That has a couple of will have a couple of benefits. First of all, those rooms, particularly this time of year, we get very few winter visitors in the winter, and so on a day like today, you might only get one or two visitors in. In the past, those lights would have stayed on all day and nobody going into the rooms. Now with the light sensors, those lights won't be on, they'll only go in when somebody goes up there. It also means at the end of the day, those lights don't get left on if somebody forgets to switch them off. But also it means our staff, whoever's having to lock up, they don't have to go climbing up 3 flights of stairs twice in our building to actually switch the lights off. So it's a win-win situation, really. We've also produced a couple of posters which are going to go up. They will come on show really in after Christmas, which to show our visitors what we're doing, and a little bit about how climate change can impact us, because we feel we want to show people that it's really important to have that message out there and to educate our visitors as well, that climate change is also about us, our museum, and what impact it's having on us. So that's going on. And there's 2 other major things that are in the pipeline, which we won't be using the grant for, but it's just to show you how this sort of has influenced our thinking. We are currently involved in developing a fairly large and major project, which we'll need grant funding from the Arts Council. But that includes a new garden room, but our plans are that will have solar panels on it. And the solar panels will then not only help for that room, but they will also feed back into the energy costs of the whole building. And for us, that's quite a delicate thing, because we're a Grade 2 listed building in a conservation area. We can't just stick solar panels up anywhere on the building. They have to be designed properly in order for it to go in. The other thing is, as a Georgian building, we're planning a new exhibition for next year, which is on our costumes, and particularly our Georgian costumes. So as part of that, we want to do something on how the Georgians themselves were quite sustainable, really. Because they used to make, do and mend. They would reuse their costumes, cut them down, remake them into other things. So that will form part of our exhibition. And it's still very much in its infancy, but we're thinking about putting on some things for activities like the make, do and mend type things. So people can come in and have a go at doing something as simple like how do you darn a pair of socks, things like that, because they're quite fun things to do, but also I think people will be quite interested on how to do things. So there's a lot going on, and we've used our money in a if you like, quite a bitty way, but I think it's had quite an influence throughout the whole museum, which for us in our context is the important thing for us at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marion. And what I love about your project is that it's such a good example of how you can take small steps and how they just add up, and they add up and add up and add up, and before you know it, you've got success in your galleries.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. It's great if you've got a big project to do, but actually by doing all these little things, it can make a big difference. And I think that's where I think sometimes when people are applying for grants, you don't necessarily have to have a big thing. You can have lots of little things, I think, which can make a difference.
Definitely. Thank you very much, Mary. I'm going to stop sharing this now because I'd like to see your lovely faces. But I also have a video for you from our 3rd case study of the day for a slightly different project. So I'm going to see if it'll work on my ropey old laptop, make, do and mend, and hopefully you'll be able to see it. Bear with me 1 second. Anyone see that okay? Give me a nod. Yep, lovely. I'll press play then.
Hello everybody, my name is Louisa Jones. I am the Learning and Engagement Manager at Amberley Museum. We're a small independent industrial museum, mainly outdoors, based in West Sussex. And I'm here to talk to you about our Going Green grant proposal, which was accepted right at the beginning of 2023 to purchase a cargo tricycle for our 36-acre site. So we really wanted to use this grant to reduce our Scope 1 carbon emissions. So that means what we are producing ourselves by our activities on site, as opposed to perhaps what is emitted on our behalf by energy providers, or as a result of the consumables that we purchase from a third party. We also wanted to reduce noise pollution, visual pollution, and air pollution. And this was reducing the atmosphere and potentially the visitor experience as well. So those were our main objectives. We decided that if we bought an electric tricycle, that would make it much more accessible for all members of staff and potentially volunteers to use this, making it a lot better investment. And we also wanted to buy from a local business, so that would cut down on transport emissions, not just when it was delivered to us in the first instance, but then when it would need to go off for its yearly services, for example. So we had that longer term view in mind as well of sustainability. So it's been used now, we've had it for 6 months, and it's been used by all departments that we have. A lot of maintenance, so bin emptying, for example, carrying tools, carrying materials to parts of our site where maintenance is needed, but then ditto for learning resources, curatorial gear, stocks for our shop and for our cafe. So it has transformed the way that we use vehicles on our site for the better. We don't carry humans, though, unfortunately, or dogs. So it's not a shuttle service. It is just for bits and bobs. So it's a self-contained project which can make a tangible difference to your carbon emissions on site with immediate effect. So it was a no-brainer for us for this amount of money. When the Going Green grant just first started, it was, I think, smaller than it is today. So we received £2,000 for our purchase from South East Museums Development, and then it was topped up by a further £1,000 by a very kind volunteer donation. So we purchased the bike for £3,000, which was a charity rate agreed between us and our supplier. I would definitely recommend the brand, which is Baboo. They are a brand from the Netherlands, but they're supplied by Raleigh in the UK. They're actually owned by Raleigh now as well. They're very well built. And in summary, I would 100% recommend investing in a cargo tricycle for large sites that are outdoors, a little bit like ours. It's not just a tangible difference that you're making to your own site's emissions, but there's also the fact that you're living your values as an organisation for visitors to see. I think that's really important. People love to see us out on bicycles and tricycles at the museum. It fits with our themes, but I think also there is just a bit of joy there in seeing people doing something a little bit different than what might be considered the norm. And it's provoked some really good conversations about past versus the present, and maybe going into the future of how we can go back to more active transport. We've had our local bike shop come to 2 of our events that we've had on this year, so the World Environment Day and also Retro Wheels, which is all about cycling through the ages. They've been able to help us spread that message, but also they've made some sales as a result. So it's been a win-win and a really nice relationship to see develop. So if this has whet your appetite, there's lots of research that you can do, lots of different bike companies, different accessories you can get depending on what your needs are. If you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, or if you just like to share some of the pros and the cons and get in touch with me in advance, then you're welcome to do that. My email address is louisa, louisa.jones@amberleymuseum.co.uk. And I hope to spread the cargo bicycle tricycle revolution to more museums, and hope whatever you do, you find a great way to contribute at your institution to the solutions to the climate and ecological crisis. Hello.
Right. Well, Thank you, Louisa, even though she couldn't be here. So this is just a couple of things that you might want to try out at your own sites if you're feeling fired up by what you've learned. So one of the first things we suggest you do is kind of what Marion was talking about, and also what Karen talked about as well, sort of making your voice heard with the people that you influence. So talking to your board, getting your volunteers on side. But you could also sort of follow this up the chain to your MP if you want to talk about sort of local infrastructure and public transport, for example. But as well down the chain too, to your visitors and how you communicate those ideas and how you communicate how people become more environmentally friendly, like what Marion was saying, those small changes and the things that add up. You could also think about education. So both for your visitors, if you wanted to run sort of make do amend sessions, as we heard about, but also about yourselves. So you might want to think about becoming carbon literate certified, which is a certification you can take to any job, so you don't have to leave it at where you are now, or perhaps wider training as well. We have a skills builder grant that's available up until March, I believe. So if you want to look at some more formal training, we can help you with that as well. You could think about doing a green audit, like we heard about with Julie's bicycle, thinking about having a strategy on how you look at all the different areas of what your organisation does, but also about your carbon footprint as well. And as we saw from Marion's slide there, it was very illuminating, sort of looking at the waste and other aspects that were beyond control and within control. So that could be a really good way to start. You could think about writing an environmental responsibility policy. You may already have one of these from when accreditation used to require you to have one, but you might want to think about digging it out and having a think about what your organisation could do as a policy for the whole site. Like, do you want to recycle? Do you want to have green ideas running through your whole culture? Which it sounds like our three case studies definitely seem to grasp onto that trend. So that would be really good. And as we heard from Louisa around workplace culture, so that reduce and reuse and recycle ethos, that she talked about the trike being very on brand, how their customers responded to it. So sort of reflecting your green values, both internally and externally. You could also work with communities. We didn't have a co-curation example for you this time because it wasn't ready, but hopefully we'll have one for you soon. So think about mobilizing your community, getting them on board, getting them thinking about how to work together. And the last things that I wanted to mention was our Green Resources Hub. Now, this is something I'm going to be sending you at the end of the session, and it's a really practical page full of links to all different aspects of going green that can help you figure out where to get funding, examples of good practice, ways to go greener, ideas, all sorts of things. So I'd recommend you have a look at that. And we'll also be sending you a green tips handout as well. And I think the only thing I wanted to sort of finish on with the practical approaches is just remembering that sort of old-fashioned ethos these days of reduce, reuse and recycle, because that's kind of make, do, amend idea. It worked brilliantly during the war. It works well now. If it's not broken, don't fix it. Have a go, see if you can come up with some interesting things. So these are grants for up to £4,000. If you're accredited, provisionally accredited, or formally working towards accreditation in the South East and you're not an NPO museum, you can apply for these. The grants can be used to support a range of activity, but we're specifically looking for things that have got a bit of a strategic aim to it. So thinking about what Marion did in her project, where she had that audit and then she did things after it, that's the sort of thing that would be perfect for this. But also what Karen did as well, where she identified a key problem and then worked out a solution. It's a very strategic grant, so that's what we're after. Some of the ideas that might get you started, you might want to think about commissioning some research. So that work around getting all that data together to do one of those audits. There are companies that do that if you're really struggling for capacity. So this could be something you think about putting towards that. Pilio is a company that does that. I believe it comes in about £5,000. So this would get you 3/4 of the way there. You could also think about purchasing equipment to lower your carbon emissions. So thinking about Karen's grant, she had those heaters in to with the regulators on so that she could lower those emissions directly. You could think about consultancy or specialist support. So if you want to work with someone who really knows their stuff about one aspect or another, it could be perfect for this. We're always interested in partnerships and collaborations. So if you know a group that you can work with and you can really get some traction going, that would be ideal. You could also think about actual programming if you wanted to do something specifically around maybe educating visitors about environmental issues. So depending on what your site is, it might lend itself to that. If you're in an industrial site, that could be really good, talking about the Industrial Revolution, kind of the start of climate change and what industry is doing now could be a really nice arc. Or if you're a seaside museum and you want to think about kind of sea pollution, that kind of thing, could be ideal. We will also support things like design and marketing costs to promote initiatives and good practice. So if you are going to do some exhibitions work, this could potentially go into that, as long as it's strategic and it's not just part of your usual exhibitions program. So if it's an aspect of something that you're doing, that would fit nicely. And we support the environmental responsibility investment principle. So if you're familiar with Arts Council's Let's Create strategy, you can use this grant to do work that sits under that. So if you are involved with the Arts Council in other ways, you might find that this sits nicely with your current aims and objectives. The application deadline is the 1st of December at 5 o'clock. And thank you. Remember, reduce, reuse, recycle, and join our mailing list if you want to. Thank you very much.